To be chosen is not always a blessing in the way the world imagines. It is not fame, not comfort, not constant companionship. It is a call to depth, to truth, and to individuality. Carl Jung reminds us that the path of individuation, the journey of becoming who you truly are, often requires walking alone. In this lecture, Why a Chosen Man Always Walks Alone, Carl Jung, we will explore the profound solitude that accompanies those who dare to separate from the crowd, detach from external noise, and live in alignment with their inner self. Walking alone does not mean isolation. It means refusing to betray your authentic path for the sake of approval. It is in solitude that clarity arises, that the shadow is faced, and that inner strength is forged. To be chosen is to accept this aloneness and to discover in it the power to live authentically. The path of individuation and why it requires solitude is one of the most profound truths in Carl Jung's psychology, because individuation is not a collective journey, but an intensely personal one. Individuation means becoming who you truly are, a process of integrating the conscious and unconscious aspects of your psyche into a unified whole. This journey cannot be walked by following the crowd or leaning too heavily on the opinions and expectations of others, because the very essence of individuation is to separate from collective identities in order to uncover the deeper self. The collective encourages conformity because shared norms and values maintain cohesion in society, but individuation requires breaking away from these patterns to discover what is uniquely yours. Solitude becomes necessary, not as punishment, but as the condition that allows the psyche to reorganize itself according to its own inner blueprint, rather than external pressures. When Jung spoke of individuation, he did not describe it as an easy or glamorous path. It is often painful, marked by periods of isolation, uncertainty, and confrontation with aspects of the self that are difficult to face. In solitude, the noise of the outside world fades, and the unconscious begins to make itself known through dreams, symbols, and feelings that surface when distractions are removed. Many avoid solitude because it confronts them with their own shadow, the parts of themselves they would rather deny. But individuation requires facing the shadow, integrating it, and reclaiming the energy it holds. Without solitude, this confrontation is nearly impossible because constant noise and social activity provide endless opportunities for avoidance. By stepping into solitude, the chosen individual accepts the necessity of meeting the hidden self and begins the process of becoming whole. The reason individuation requires solitude is that the path is deeply unique. Each psyche has its own pattern, its own archetypal journey that cannot be replicated or mapped onto another. The collective can provide general guidelines, cultural traditions, or shared myths, but ultimately the individual must discover their own meaning. Solitude allows space for this personal meaning to emerge without being smothered by collective values. A chosen man who seeks to live authentically must therefore step away from the crowd, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity, because no one else can walk his path for him. The loneliness that accompanies this detachment is the price of authenticity, and Jung believed it was a price worth paying, because only in this way can the individual encounter the self the inner center of wholeness that gives life direction and purpose. In solitude, the archetypal images of the unconscious become clearer. Jung noted that myths and symbols are not relics of the past, but living forces within the psyche, guiding us through universal patterns of transformation. Heroes in myth often leave their communities to embark on solitary journeys into forests, deserts, or underworlds, facing trials that no one else can endure for them. This reflects the psychological reality of individuation. The chosen individual must step outside the comfort of the collective to engage directly with the forces of the unconscious. Just as the hero in myth returns with wisdom or treasure to share, the individuated person eventually enters society with a greater sense of authenticity and contribution. But the journey into solitude cannot be skipped, because without it, the treasures of the unconscious remain hidden. Solitude also reveals the fragility of the ego. In daily social interactions, the ego is reinforced through roles, conversations, and recognition from others. But in solitude, these reinforcements fall away, leaving the ego exposed. This can feel destabilizing because the ego begins to realize it is not the center of the psyche, but merely one part of a larger whole. Jung believed that this recognition was crucial for individuation, because only when the ego surrenders its illusion of supremacy can the self emerge as the true center. This surrender often feels like a kind of death, a loss of the old identity, and it is one of the reasons solitude can feel so challenging. Yet it is also liberating, because once the ego relinquishes its false dominance, the individual begins to live from a deeper and more stable source of identity. Another reason solitude is essential for individuation is that it fosters direct contact with inner guidance. When surrounded by the noise of society, it is easy to mistake the voices of others for your own. Opinions of family, culture, and peers infiltrate the psyche, making it difficult to discern what you truly want or believe. Solitude strips away these influences, leaving only the voice of the unconscious. This voice often emerges in dreams, synchronicities, or sudden insights that appear in moments of quiet reflection. By listening to these messages, the individual begins to navigate life according to inner wisdom rather than external approval. This is a radical shift in orientation, and it is only possible when one steps away from the constant pull of collective noise. The solitude of individuation is not empty. It is filled with symbolic encounters. Jung often spoke of active imagination as a way of engaging with the unconscious, allowing inner figures and images to reveal themselves and entering into dialogue with them. This practice requires solitude because it demands focus and receptivity. In these encounters, the individual meets aspects of themselves personified in symbolic form. Figures of wisdom, trickery, guidance, or opposition that represent parts of the psyche seeking integration. Each dialogue strengthens the individual by bringing unconscious material into consciousness, gradually weaving together the fragmented self into a unified whole. Without solitude, this inner dialogue is drowned out by external voices, and the process of individuation is stalled. The chosen man who walks the path of individuation must also confront the loneliness that comes with solitude. Friends, family, and society may not understand his withdrawal, and he may feel alienated from those who continue to live according to collective norms. This loneliness can feel like exile, but Jung would say it is a necessary exile, because only by standing apart can the individual see clearly. The perspective gained in solitude eventually allows the individuated person to return to the community with insights that enrich it. In this way, individuation is not selfish, but ultimately contributes to the collective. But the contribution is authentic precisely because it arises from a journey into solitude rather than blind conformity. The solitude of individuation also teaches endurance. In the absence of external validation, the individual learns to rely on inner strength. This self-reliance is what makes the chosen man resilient, because his sense of worth no longer depends on others. He discovers that he can survive without constant approval, and this discovery transforms him. Pain may still come, but it no longer destroys him, because his foundation is internal rather than external. This resilience is one of the hallmarks of individuation, and it is forged in solitude, where the individual learns to stand firmly on their own ground. Solitude also sharpens the ability to perceive synchronicities, the meaningful coincidences Jung saw as signs of alignment between the inner and outer worlds. When the mind is quiet and detached from external distractions, these synchronicities become more visible. They affirm that the path of individuation, though solitary, is not random, but guided by a deeper order. Recognizing these patterns strengthens faith in the process and encourages perseverance through loneliness. The chosen man begins to see that his solitude is not emptiness, but alignment with a larger rhythm of life. The transformative nature of solitude can also be seen in its relationship to creativity. Many of Jung's insights came during his solitary explorations of the unconscious, expressed through painting, writing, and building. Creativity emerges naturally in solitude because the unconscious has room to speak without interference. The chosen man who embraces solitude often finds himself drawn to creative expression, not for recognition, but as a way of making visible the depths of his psyche. This creativity is itself a form of individuation, a bridge between the inner and outer worlds that helps integrate unconscious material into consciousness. Through this process, solitude becomes a fertile ground for self-discovery and self-expression. Ultimately, the path of individuation requires solitude because the journey is singular. No one else can live your life for you, face your shadow for you, or integrate your unconscious for you. The chosen man must walk alone because only he can confront his unique psyche with its particular history, wounds, and potentials. Solitude provides the space for this confrontation, the silence for this listening, and the strength for this integration. Though the path is lonely, it is also sacred because it leads to authenticity, wholeness, and the realization of the self. And in that realization, the chosen man discovers that his solitude was never emptiness, but the necessary condition for becoming who he truly is. Walking alone leads to deeper self, discovery, and shadow integration, because solitude creates the conditions in which the unconscious can be heard, explored, and integrated into conscious life. Carl Jung believed that most people spend their lives avoiding themselves, by filling every moment with noise, social roles, and external activity. These distractions keep the unconscious at bay, preventing the difficult work of facing hidden truths. But when one walks alone, physically, emotionally, or spiritually, the distractions diminish, and the psyche is forced to confront itself. This confrontation is often uncomfortable because the shadow, the collection of repressed, denied, or disowned qualities within us emerges most clearly in silence and solitude. Yet it is precisely this confrontation that makes individuation possible, and it is through this process that deeper self-discovery unfolds. The chosen individual who dares to walk alone enters into this territory willingly, knowing that growth requires passing through the wilderness of the inner world. In solitude, the shadow reveals itself not as an abstract concept, but as living reality. A man who has always seen himself as gentle may encounter unexpected rage. A woman who prides herself on selflessness may discover hidden selfishness. A person who clings to rationality may be confronted with irrational impulses and fantasies. These realizations often feel like betrayals of the identity we work so hard to maintain. Yet Jung insisted they are not enemies, but parts of the psyche seeking integration. Walking alone means there is no one to project these disowned aspects onto. Without constant external interaction, the shadow cannot be as easily hidden or dismissed. It rises to the surface in dreams, emotions, and sudden insights, forcing acknowledgement. Though this confrontation can be frightening, it is also liberating, because each aspect of the shadow that is faced becomes a source of energy and wholeness once integrated. Self-discovery is not simply a matter of uncovering pleasant truths about oneself. It is often raw, painful, and destabilizing. In solitude, we come to see not only our strengths, but our weaknesses, our wounds, and our contradictions. Jung argued that wholeness is more important than goodness, meaning that true growth requires accepting the totality of who we are, not just the parts that are socially acceptable. Walking alone strips away the comfort of constant validation and leaves us with the unvarnished reality of our being. This honesty can be difficult to bear, but it is also the foundation of authenticity. To know oneself deeply is to accept both light and shadow, both virtues and flaws, and to discover that worth does not depend on perfection, but on integration. The path of solitude also sharpens awareness of projections. When we live constantly in the presence of others, it is easy to blame them for qualities we deny in ourselves. We accuse others of being angry, selfish, arrogant, or weak, while refusing to see those same traits within. But when we are alone, there is no one to project onto. The anger, selfishness, arrogance, or weakness we feel cannot be explained away by pointing outward. It must be owned as part of us. This recognition is one of the deepest forms of self-discovery, because it forces us to take responsibility for the qualities we once disowned. Jung believed that projections were among the greatest obstacles to self-knowledge, and solitude removes this obstacle by confronting us with the reality that what we see in others is often a reflection of what we refuse to see in ourselves. Solitude also creates the silence necessary for listening to the unconscious. In the stillness of being alone, dreams become more vivid, intuitions more noticeable, and synchronicities more meaningful. Jung saw these as communications from the unconscious, guiding us toward wholeness, but they are easily drowned out in the noise of collective life. Walking alone makes us more receptive to these messages because we are no longer distracted by the constant chatter of society. Self-discovery deepens as we learn to pay attention to these subtle signals, recognizing that they carry wisdom the conscious mind cannot generate on its own. This dialogue with the unconscious is essential for shadow integration because it reveals what the ego would prefer to ignore. The unconscious does not speak in rational arguments, but in symbols, images, and experiences that demand interpretation. Solitude is the environment in which we can engage with these symbols without distraction, allowing the unconscious to unfold its meaning. Walking alone also strengthens resilience because it teaches us to face inner fears without escape. Many avoid solitude because it forces them to feel emotions they would rather suppress. Grief, loneliness, anxiety, anger. But these emotions do not disappear simply because we avoid them. They linger in the unconscious, shaping behavior and creating suffering. In solitude, we must face them directly. This confrontation reveals that the emotions themselves are not as unbearable as we feared, and in the process, we learn we can endure them. This realization builds resilience because once we have survived our own depths, the external world loses much of its power to destabilize us. Shadow integration occurs when we stop running from these emotions and instead allow them to be part of us, acknowledging their presence and learning from them. Creativity often emerges as a natural result of this process. Jung himself experienced periods of solitude in which he engaged deeply with his unconscious through art, writing, and building. Creativity provides a way of expressing and integrating the shadow, making visible what was once hidden. Walking alone often awakens this creative impulse because the unconscious, no longer suppressed by external distractions, seeks expression. Art, journaling, or other forms of creative work become tools for self-discovery, allowing us to explore aspects of ourselves that words alone cannot capture. Each act of creation becomes an integration, a way of bringing unconscious material into consciousness and weaving it into the fabric of the self. In this way, solitude not only deepens self-discovery, but also produces tangible expressions of integration that enrich both the individual and the collective. The archetypal dimension of walking alone is also significant. Across cultures and traditions, figures who undergo transformation often do so in solitude. Prophets retreat into deserts. Shamans journey into forests. Heroes descend into underworlds. These myths reflect the psychological truth that individuation requires separation from the collective. Solitude symbolizes this separation, and the trials encountered in aloneness symbolize the confrontation with the shadow. By walking alone, the chosen individual enacts an archetypal pattern, one that leads to deeper wisdom and strength. This archetypal resonance gives meaning to the loneliness, reminding us that it is not a personal failure, but part of a universal process of transformation. Self-discovery in solitude also involves realizing that the shadow is not only darkness, but also unrealized potential. Jung emphasized that the shadow contains not just destructive impulses, but also hidden talents, passions, and strengths that we repress because they did not fit our persona. Walking alone allows these potentials to surface because we are no longer bound by constant performance for others. In solitude, we may discover creativity, leadership, or courage that we had denied. By integrating these qualities, we expand our sense of self and become more whole. This expansion is another reason solitude is essential for individuation, because it allows us to reclaim the fullness of our being, both the light we denied and the darkness we feared. The loneliness of walking alone is real, and it can be one of the hardest parts of the journey. Yet this loneliness itself becomes a teacher. It shows us how much of our sense of self was dependent on others, and it challenges us to find worth within. By enduring loneliness, we discover that we are not as dependent as we believed, and this discovery strengthens us. Jung suggested that individuation often requires a symbolic death, the death of the old identity tied to collective roles. Solitude is the crucible in which this death and rebirth occur. It strips away false identities and reveals the deeper self beneath them. Though painful, this process creates a sense of freedom, because once we have walked alone and faced ourselves, we no longer fear being abandoned or rejected. We know that we can endure, and that knowledge is a source of unshakable resilience. Ultimately, walking alone leads to deeper self discovery and shadow integration, because it removes the distractions and illusions that keep us from ourselves. It forces us to face what we would rather deny, to integrate what we would rather project, and to discover truths we could not see in the noise of collective life. The solitude of the chosen man is not emptiness, but fullness, not weakness, but strength. It is the space in which the unconscious reveals itself. The shadow is integrated, and the self begins to emerge as the true center of identity. This is why those who are chosen to walk the path of individuation must often walk alone, because only in aloneness can the depths of the psyche be fully encountered and transformed. Detaching from collective expectations to live authentically is at the very heart of Carl Jung's idea of individuation, because the journey to becoming whole demands the courage to separate from the values, roles, and norms that society insists we follow. From early childhood, we are taught what is acceptable, what is rewarded, and what is forbidden. These lessons shape the persona, the mask we wear to fit into the world, to gain approval, and to avoid rejection. The persona is necessary for survival in the collective. But when we confuse it with our true identity, we lose contact with the deeper self. We end up living lives dictated by external scripts rather than by our own inner truth. Detaching from collective expectations does not mean becoming antisocial or rejecting community altogether. Rather, it means recognizing where conformity has suffocated authenticity, and then taking the difficult steps toward reclaiming one's own voice, values, and path. This detachment often requires solitude, misunderstanding from others, and the courage to stand apart, but it is the only way to live a life that feels whole and meaningful. The collective thrives on sameness. Societies create rules, traditions, and shared beliefs to ensure stability and cohesion. These shared frameworks provide security, but they also create pressure to conform. When everyone follows the same patterns, those who deviate risk judgment, exclusion, or ridicule. For this reason, many people never dare to question collective expectations. They live out lives that others have designed for them, careers chosen by cultural prestige, relationships shaped by social approval, lifestyles modeled on what is popular, rather than what is true to the soul. This conformity may bring temporary comfort, but often results in emptiness, because it disconnects the individual from their inner voice. Jung saw countless patients whose suffering stemmed not from illness, but from the loss of meaning. And this loss of meaning was frequently the result of living according to collective norms rather than authentic individuality. Detaching from collective expectations is the first step in restoring meaning, because it clears the path back to the self. Living authentically means asking questions that the collective discourages. Who am I beyond the roles I play? What do I value when no one is watching? What path calls to me, even if it disappoints those around me? These questions require deep honesty, and they often lead to answers that challenge collective assumptions. A person may realize that the career they pursued for prestige leaves them unfulfilled, that the relationships they maintain for appearances are draining, or that the beliefs they inherited no longer resonate with their experience of life. Acting on these realizations often leads to friction with the collective, because authenticity disrupts conformity. Yet Jung insisted that individuation cannot happen without this disruption. To become whole, one must choose truth over comfort, authenticity over approval, even if it means walking alone. Detaching from collective expectations also demands shadow work, because much of what we repress into the shadow are qualities society has deemed unacceptable. For example, ambition may be repressed in cultures that value humility, or vulnerability may be repressed in cultures that prize toughness. By internalizing these expectations, we disown vital aspects of ourselves, leaving us fragmented and weak. To live authentically, we must reclaim these shadow qualities, even if doing so challenges societal norms. This reclamation does not mean acting them out recklessly, but integrating them consciously into our lives. When we take back what we have repressed, we become more whole and less dependent on the collective to define us. Jung taught that wholeness is not achieved by conforming to ideals, but by embracing the totality of the self. Detachment from collective expectations allows us to see what parts of ourselves have been sacrificed to fit in, and integration restores those parts to our identity. One of the most powerful ways collective expectations shape us is through the fear of rejection. Humans are wired to seek belonging, and this instinct makes conformity tempting. But Jung pointed out that individuation often requires a symbolic death, the death of the old identity tied to the collective. This death can feel like social rejection, exile, or loneliness, but it is also the gateway to rebirth into authenticity. When we detach from collective approval, we face the fear of being misunderstood or excluded. Yet in facing this fear, we discover that survival does not depend on constant validation. We learn that our worth does not diminish when others disapprove, and this realization frees us to live authentically. In this sense, detachment is not about rejecting community altogether, but about refusing to let community dictate our deepest truth. Detaching from the collective also brings clarity about the difference between values imposed from outside and values that arise from within. Collective values often emphasize efficiency, productivity, status, and conformity. Inner values, discovered through introspection and dialogue with the unconscious, may emphasize creativity, compassion, freedom, or spiritual depth. These inner values are often at odds with what the collective rewards. For example, a person may feel called to a life of simplicity and service in a society that glorifies wealth and consumption. To follow this calling requires detachment, because the collective will not offer validation. Yet it is precisely by following inner values that life becomes meaningful, because authenticity aligns us with the self. Jung described the self as the regulating center of the psyche, the source of inner guidance. By detaching from collective expectations, we make space for the self to guide us, and this guidance leads to a life that is coherent and whole. The myths and archetypes Jung studied also illuminate this process. Heroes often step away from their communities to embark on solitary quests. Prophets retreat into deserts or mountains. Shamans journey into forests, and seekers leave familiar worlds to face trials alone. These stories symbolize the psychological truth that individuation requires separation from the collective. The chosen man or woman who seeks authenticity must walk apart, not to reject the community, but to return to it. Transformed, the treasures gained in solitude, wisdom, strength, creativity, authenticity, eventually enrich the collective. But they can only be found by detaching first. This archetypal pattern reassures us that walking alone is not selfish, but necessary, because it fulfills a larger purpose of contributing something new and authentic to humanity. Another aspect of detaching from collective expectations is the discovery of inner authority. As long as we are bound by collective norms, our decisions are guided by external voices. What parents say, what society rewards, what peers expect. These voices drown out the quieter voice of intuition, the subtle guidance of the unconscious. Detachment allows us to hear this inner authority more clearly. It teaches us to trust synchronicities, to pay attention to dreams, and to follow intuitions, even when they contradict logic or convention. This shift builds resilience, because our lives are no longer controlled by shifting social tides, but anchored in a deeper wisdom. Jung argued that true freedom comes not from rejecting all authority, but from recognizing the authority of the self, which unites conscious and unconscious and points us toward wholeness. The process of detachment can also awaken creativity. When we conform to collective expectations, creativity is often stifled because originality threatens conformity. But once we detach, the unconscious begins to express itself freely through art, writing, problem solving, or new ways of living. Creativity becomes a natural byproduct of authenticity, because the self seeks expression. Jung himself found that his creative practices, painting mandalas, sculpting, writing, were essential to his individuation. These practices were not about pleasing others, but about giving form to the unconscious. Similarly, when we detach from collective demands, our creativity flows not from external validation, but from inner necessity. This creativity is a sign of authenticity, a tangible expression of living in alignment with the self. Living authentically after detaching from the collective does not mean life becomes easy. On the contrary, it often brings new challenges, criticism, misunderstanding, or loneliness. But it also brings freedom. No longer bound by false roles, we can act with integrity. No longer afraid of rejection, we can pursue paths that resonate with our deepest values. No longer hiding parts of ourselves, we can live as whole beings. This freedom is resilience because it means that nothing external can completely destabilize us. We may still feel pain, but it does not shatter us because our worth is not tied to external approval. Jung believed that authenticity was the true goal of individuation, and authenticity can only arise from detachment. In the end, detaching from collective expectations to live authentically is both a sacrifice and a gift. It requires letting go of comfort, approval, and belonging in their conventional forms. It requires facing loneliness, shadow, and uncertainty, but it gives back a life rooted in truth, meaning, and wholeness. It gives back the strength of resilience, the clarity of inner authority, and the creativity of the self. And though the chosen individual may walk alone for stretches of the journey, the authenticity they cultivate eventually enriches not only their own life, but the life of the community. For the greatest contribution we can make to the collective is not conformity, but authenticity. And this contribution can only be born from the courage to detach and live as we truly are. The hidden strength and purpose found in the chosen man's solitude is a theme that runs throughout Carl Jung's work, because solitude is not merely a condition of being alone, but a crucible in which the psyche is transformed. The chosen man, the individual who steps away from the noise of the collective to walk his own path, often feels at first that his solitude is a curse. It can feel like abandonment, exile, or punishment for refusing to conform. Yet Jung understood solitude differently. He saw it as the necessary space in which the unconscious can rise to meet the conscious mind, where the individual can confront the shadow, integrate repressed aspects, and discover the self as the true center of identity. Solitude is not emptiness, but fullness, not weakness, but strength, because in it the chosen individual discovers resilience, clarity, creativity, and meaning that cannot be found in the crowd. The strength found in solitude begins with the discovery of self-reliance. When surrounded by others, it is easy to lean on external validation for a sense of worth. Approval, praise, and recognition become the foundation of identity. But in solitude, those reinforcements vanish. The chosen man must turn inward and find within himself the resources to endure. At first, this can feel terrifying because the ego has been conditioned to depend on others. But as the days of solitude deepen, he discovers that he can survive without constant approval. He learns that his identity does not collapse when no one is there to affirm it. This discovery is transformative because it creates a resilience that no external rejection can undo. Once you know you can endure alone, the fear of abandonment loses its power, and this freedom allows you to live more authentically. Solitude also strengthens the relationship with the unconscious. Jung believed that the unconscious is always present, always active, but often ignored or suppressed in the noise of daily life. Solitude strips away distractions and creates silence, and in that silence the unconscious speaks. Dreams become more vivid, synchronicities more noticeable, and inner images more insistent. The chosen man who listens begins to recognize patterns in his life, symbols that carry meaning, and intuitions that guide him. This dialogue with the unconscious builds strength because it provides a source of wisdom greater than the ego. Instead of navigating life blindly or depending solely on collective norms, the individual begins to live in partnership with the unconscious. This partnership creates confidence because it reassures him that he is guided by forces deeper than rational planning. The purpose of solitude also lies in its capacity to reveal the shadow. In the crowd, it is easy to project unwanted qualities onto others. Anger, jealousy, weakness, selfishness, all of these can be denied and attributed to those around us. But when one walks alone, there is no one to carry these projections. The shadow surfaces within, demanding acknowledgement. This confrontation can be painful because it forces us to see parts of ourselves we have long denied. Yet it is also liberating because each shadow quality that is integrated becomes a source of power. Anger becomes the energy to set boundaries. Selfishness becomes the ability to protect one's needs. Vulnerability becomes the capacity for intimacy. Solitude provides the environment in which this integration can occur, because without distractions, we are forced to face ourselves fully. The strength that arises from shadow integration is profound, because once we own our darkness, it can no longer control us from the shadows. Another hidden strength of solitude is clarity. In the collective, the individual is bombarded with expectations: what to value, how to behave, who to become. These external voices drown out the inner voice of the self. Solitude silences them, leaving space for clarity to emerge. The chosen man who embraces solitude begins to hear his own voice more distinctly, and he discovers what truly matters to him. Decisions become less about pleasing others and more about alignment with inner truth. This clarity reduces confusion and conflict because the individual no longer lives divided between his own desires and the expectations of others. The clarity gained in solitude becomes a compass, guiding choices with confidence and integrity. This is why many spiritual traditions emphasize retreat, silence, or withdrawal, not to escape life, but to see it more clearly. The purpose of solitude is also creative. Jung himself experienced this during his years of inner exploration, when he retreated to his tower at Bollingen and engaged in painting, building, and writing. Solitude opened the channel for creativity because the unconscious could express itself freely. Creativity is one of the most direct ways the unconscious communicates. And in solitude, its voice is not drowned out by external demands. The chosen man often finds that solitude awakens in him a drive to create art, music, writing, or new ways of thinking. These creations are not merely personal, but carry universal significance because they arise from archetypal depths. Creativity thus becomes a bridge between the individual and the collective, allowing the treasures discovered in solitude to be shared with the world. This is one of the hidden purposes of solitude. It is not for isolation, but for the birth of something new that can enrich the collective once the individual returns. Resilience is another gift of solitude. Life inevitably brings suffering, loss, and uncertainty. When identity is based on collective approval, these experiences can shatter the self. But when identity is rooted in solitude, in the strength of the self, suffering becomes more bearable. The chosen man who has endured loneliness, faced his shadow, and listened to the unconscious carries within him a foundation that cannot be easily broken. Pain still comes, but it no longer destroys him because he knows he can endure. This resilience is not born of denial or numbness, but of integration. By walking alone, he has faced the depths of his psyche and discovered that he is stronger than he imagined. This knowledge makes him less vulnerable to external forces because he no longer fears being undone by them. The archetypal dimension of solitude reveals its larger purpose. Across cultures, myths tell of figures who withdraw from the collective to undergo transformation. Prophets retreat into deserts, shamans journey into forests, heroes descend into underworlds. These stories symbolize the psychological truth that solitude is the environment in which transformation occurs. The chosen man who walks alone participates in this archetypal journey, whether he realizes it or not. His solitude is not meaningless. It is part of a universal pattern of growth. Recognizing this pattern provides comfort because it reassures him that his loneliness has purpose. He is not merely isolated, but participating in a timeless process of becoming. This meaning itself is a source of strength because pain that carries meaning is easier to endure than pain that feels random. Another hidden purpose of solitude is humility. In the collective, it is easy to become inflated with the ego, feeding off recognition, status, or praise. Solitude strips these away, leaving the individual face with his own limitations. In solitude, one realizes that the ego is not the center of the psyche, but a small part of a larger whole. This humility is not humiliation, but balance. It prevents arrogance and opens the individual to the guidance of the unconscious. Humility is strength because it creates openness to learning, growth, and connection with forces greater than oneself. The chosen man who has learned humility in solitude becomes more grounded, less swayed by pride or fear, and more capable of living authentically. Solitude also teaches presence. In the collective, the mind is often scattered, worrying about the future, replaying the past, distracted by constant activity. In solitude, these distractions diminish and the individual is confronted with the present moment. Learning to be present is itself a form of strength because it reduces anxiety and increases clarity. Presence allows the chosen man to engage fully with life as it is, rather than being trapped in what was or what might be. This presence becomes a source of peace, even amid challenges, and it strengthens resilience because it anchors the psyche in reality rather than illusion. The hidden purpose of solitude is also connection. Though it may seem paradoxical, solitude often deepens one's sense of connection to life, nature, and the collective unconscious. In silence, the individual becomes more attuned to the rhythms of nature, the symbols of dreams, and the synchronicities that reveal hidden order. This sense of connection brings meaning, reminding the chosen man that he is part of something larger than himself. Far from being isolation, solitude becomes a gateway to communion with the deeper patterns of existence. This communion provides comfort and guidance, making the individual feel less alone, even in physical aloneness. Ultimately, the hidden strength and purpose of the chosen man's solitude is transformation. It is in solitude that the ego surrenders its illusions, the shadow is faced, the unconscious is heard, and the self emerges as the true center. This transformation creates authenticity, resilience, creativity, and meaning. The chosen man who embraces solitude discovers that walking alone is not abandonment, but calling, not exile, but initiation. His solitude equips him to return to the world with treasures of wisdom, authenticity, and strength that can only be found in the depths of the inner journey.